The Vreth Dominion had stood for 4,000 years and it had never once asked anyone for help. It was the oldest empire in the known galaxy, a vast collection of star systems held together by iron law, cold logic, and the unbreakable will of the insectoid Vreth people, creatures with 6 limbs, hard shell-like armor covering their bodies, and eyes that saw in frequencies no human could imagine. They built their empire on one simple idea: only the strong survive, and only the strong deserve to. The Vreth did not form friendships, they formed agreements, they did not feel love, they felt duty, and they certainly did not ask other species for anything, especially not a species as young and soft and strange as humans. But then the Rift Swarm came. The Rift Swarm was not an army, it was not a civilization, it was a hunger, a living tide of creatures that moved through space like a plague, consuming everything in their path, ships, stations, planets. It did not matter. The swarm ate it all. For 200 years the Vreth Dominion had fought the swarm and pushed it back, again and again, but 200 years of war had cost them more than they would ever admit out loud. Then the swarm attacked the Kareth Gate, a massive jump point in the Outer Rim, one of the most important strategic positions in Vreth space. If the gate fell, the swarm would have a direct path into the heart of the Dominion. The Vreth fleet arrived too late. The gate was already under full attack. Their commanders calculated the odds and called for a full retreat. But someone was already there. A single human marine battalion, 700 soldiers with no reinforcements coming, had been stationed at the gate as part of a small joint observation post. They had no orders to fight. They had no strategic reason to stay. The math said they should run. They did not run. For 11 hours, those 700 humans held the Kareth Gate. They used their own broken ships as barricades. They wired the docking corridors with improvised explosives made from ship fuel and old ammunition. When their weapons ran out, they fought with tools and their own hands. 3 separate Vreth commanders sent messages telling them to fall back. All 3 messages were ignored. When the Vreth fleet finally returned and drove the swarm away from the gate, they found the human battalion, what was left of it, still standing, still fighting, covered in blood and burns and the wreckage of a battle no one believed they could survive. The Vreth military historian spent a long time trying to find the right word for what the humans had done. There was no word in the Vreth language for fighting when the math told you to stop, for refusing to lose simply because losing made more sense. 1. Historian finally wrote a new word in the official record, Kashrivan. It had no perfect translation. The closest meaning, when written in the common tongue, was something like, too angry to die. That was 12 years ago. Now, standing in the cold light of the Dominion's High Council chamber, Princess Seravan Thornblood thought about that word and felt nothing but irritation. She was the heir to the Thornblood line, the oldest and most powerful family in the Vreth Dominion. She was tall even for her kind, with deep violet shell armor and eyes the color of pale fire. There was a long scar running across her left shoulder, earned in her first battle at the age of 17. She had never hidden it. A Vreth warrior who hid their scars was a Vreth warrior who was ashamed of surviving. She had won 3 campaigns. She had rebuilt a broken fleet division in under a year. She had stood before the High Council at the age of 22 and delivered a military report so precise and detailed that the oldest generals in the room had gone quiet. She was, by every measure the Dominion had, exceptional. And today the High Council was assigning her to babysit a human. The Joint Operations Accord had been signed 8 months ago, a formal agreement between the Vreth Dominion and the human government called the Earth Coalition. The agreement created shared military units, joint command posts, and a system of liaisons. 1 Vreth officer assigned to work alongside 1 human officer at each joint station. The goal, according to the Council, was to improve cooperation between the 2 species. Seravan had read the accord 3 times. She found it overly complicated, full of soft language about partnership and mutual respect, and entirely unnecessary. The Vreth Dominion did not need human help. What it needed was for the humans to follow orders and stay out of the way. The Council had not asked her opinion. She was assigned to Joint Command Station Verith 9, a grey, utilitarian outpost on the border of contested space, and told to work alongside the human liaison already. Posted there, a commander named Dallin Voss. She had read his file on the transport ship on the way over, medium height for a human, which meant shorter than every Vreth officer she had ever met, former infantry, then tactical operations, then liaison training. His record was clean, no major failures, no dramatic victories. He had a habit, noted twice in his performance reviews, of questioning the decisions of senior officers when he believed those decisions were wrong. Seravan had read that note twice. She had not decided yet if it was a flaw or simply a fact. She arrived at Verith 9 in the early rotation cycle. The station was cold and smelled faintly of machine oil. The Vreth crew on Board stood straight when she entered. The human crew on board also stood straight, which she noted without comment. Commander Dallin Voss was waiting at the docking entrance. He was not what she expected. She was not entirely sure what she had expected, but he stood without fidgeting, without the particular nervous energy most humans showed around breadth of her rank. He looked at her directly, which humans rarely did. His face was calm. He said, "Welcome to Verith 9, Princess. I have the station briefing ready when you are." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. She said, "Show me the tactical maps first. I want to understand the threat assessment before anything else." He nodded once and turned to lead the way. No extra words, no attempts to seem friendly or impressive. Just, "Yes, and here is the door." It was, she thought, a reasonable start. She followed him down the grey corridor of Verith 9 and told herself this assignment was temporary. She would do the work, complete the liaison period, and return to the Dominion with a report that confirmed what she already believed. That cooperation with humans was a nice idea that produced very little of actual value. She told herself this with complete confidence. She had no way of knowing yet how completely wrong she was going to be. Verith 9 was not a comfortable station. It was built for function, not comfort. The corridors were narrow, the lighting was always slightly too cold, and the heating system made a low hum that never fully went away. But Seravan had lived in worse places. She had once spent 6 weeks in a forward command bunker with no running water and a ceiling that leaked coolant every time the ship fired its main guns. Compared to that, Verith 9 was fine. What was not fine was Commander Dallin Voss. He was polite, that much she had to admit. He showed up on time, kept his reports clear, and did not waste her time with unnecessary conversation. But he had a quality that she found deeply frustrating. He was not afraid of her. Most people were afraid of her, not in a panicked way, but in the quiet, careful way that people behaved around someone they knew could end their career, or their life, with a single decision. There was a particular way officers stood when she entered a room, a stiffness in their posture, a careful blankness in their expression. It was a form of respect, yes, but also a form of fear, and fear, in Seravan's experience, made people easy to manage. Dallin did not do any of that. He stood normally. He spoke directly. When she said something he disagreed with, he said so, not loudly, not rudely, but clearly, as if disagreeing with a Vreth princess was simply a thing a person could do. It happened first on the 3rd day. They were reviewing a patrol route along the outer border. A swarm scout cluster had been spotted 3 sectors away, and the current route left a gap in sensor coverage near the Ashvale approach. Seravan identified the gap and gave an order to extend the eastern patrol sweep by 6 hours. Standard Vreth doctrine, clean and efficient. Dallin looked at the map for a moment and then said, "That will work, but it pulls our reserve response unit too far east. If there is an incident near the station core while the sweep is extended, we will have a 20-minute response lag." Seravan looked at him. She said, "The swarm threat is on the eastern approach. The station core risk is low." He said, "It is low right now, but we are also 2 weeks out from a resupply rotation. If something breaks on the station during that window, a 20-minute lag is not small." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without blinking. She said, "Are you recommending a different route?" He pulled up an alternate path on the display and walked her through it. It covered the same sensor gap, brought the sweep back 6 hours earlier, and kept the reserve unit within standard response range. It was, she noted privately, a better solution than her own. She approved his route without comment. She did not tell him it was better, but she noticed it. The second incident happened on the 8th day. A coolant pipe in junction block 4 burst during the night rotation. It was a mechanical failure, not an attack, but it vented a cloud of chemical coolant through 2 connected corridors. Standard Vreth protocol was to seal the affected sections immediately and wait for the coolant to neutralize. The 3 crew members trapped in those corridors would have to wait inside in emergency suits until the clearance window opened. The suits were rated for 4 hours. The clearance window was 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was within safe limits. Seravan gave the seal order. Dallin said, "I have another option." She said, "The corridors are sealed. Protocol is clear." He said, "Protocol is a guideline for standard situations. This one has a faster fix." He was already moving toward a maintenance panel. He pulled it open and looked inside for about 10 seconds, then turned to one of the human engineers on shift and started talking quickly in the shorthand technical language that humans used when they were solving problems under pressure. Seravan watched. She did not countermand him, not because she agreed, but because she wanted to see what he was doing. What he was doing, it turned out, was rerouting the station's secondary ventilation system through the affected corridors. pushing the coolant cloud out through the external exhaust vents in under 30 minutes instead of waiting 3.5 hours. It required temporarily taking the secondary vents offline for the rest of the station, which meant the main deck would be slightly warm for 2 hours. That was the trade. The 3 crew members walked out of the sealed corridors in 28 minutes, slightly shaken, fully fine. One of those 3 crew members was a Vreth soldier named Orith. He was a member of Seravin's personal guard. He was also the youngest member of her guard, barely past his first decade of service, and he had been on a secondary task in that corridor for reasons that were, technically, her assignment. When Orith emerged from the corridor, he looked across the room at Dallin with an expression that Seravin had rarely seen on a Vreth soldier's face. It was not admiration exactly. Vreth did not admire easily, but it was something close. Seravin said nothing. That evening she sat alone in her quarters and went over the day's reports. She found herself thinking about the patrol route and the coolant fix and the way Dallin had looked at her when she sealed those corridors. He had not looked angry. He had not looked afraid. He had looked like a person with a better idea who was not going to stay quiet about it. She had given orders her entire career. She had never once had someone respond to them the way he did. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with, "Here is a better way, do you want to use it?" She did not know what to do with that. The third incident happened on the 12th day, and it was the one that stayed with her. A junior Vreth officer named Tevrath made a navigational error during a border patrol. It was not a catastrophic error, but it was a public one. It happened on the main bridge with both Vreth and human crew present. Tevrath realized his mistake immediately and corrected it, but the error was visible in the logs and visible to every person in the room. Seravin intended to address it officially in the next review. It was standard procedure. Dallin addressed it differently. After the shift ended, she saw him stop Tevrath in the corridor. She was close enough to hear. Dallin said, "You caught that fast and you fixed it clean. That matters more than the mistake." Tevrath said nothing, but the way he stood afterward was different. Seravin walked past without stopping. She did not understand why she kept turning that small moment over in her mind for the rest of the day. It seemed like such a small thing to say, and yet Tevrath had stood differently. She filed it away and told herself it was irrelevant. She was starting to suspect that nothing about Dallin Voss was irrelevant. The mission into the Ashvale Nebula was not supposed to be important. It was a survey run, 3 weeks in deep space, mapping the nebula's inner corridors and checking for swarm activity. The kind of mission that senior officers delegated to junior crews, but one of the Joint Accord protocols required a commanding officer from each species to lead joint survey operations, and so Seravin found herself boarding a mid-sized survey vessel with Dallin Voss, a crew of 12, and 3 weeks of nothing but stars and silence ahead of her. She had been on long missions before. She knew how to manage distance and time and the particular quiet that came with deep space. What she had never done was spend 3 weeks in close quarters with a human. The ship was small enough that there was no avoiding each other. The command deck, the mess, the workstations, all of it was shared space. Seravin adjusted her schedule to minimize contact during off hours. Dallin seemed to do no such thing. He simply lived at whatever pace he lived at and moved through the ship as if the proximity was completely normal. On the 4th day, she caught him sitting alone in the observation alcove at the rear of the ship. It was a small curved space with a wide viewport that looked directly into the nebula. The nebula was beautiful in a way that Seravin rarely let herself think about. Deep clouds of purple and silver gas lit from within by distant dying stars. She passed the alcove on her way to the command deck and saw him sitting there with a cup of something warm, just looking. She did not stop, but she slowed down enough to see that he was not doing anything else, not reviewing data, not running scenarios, just looking at the nebula. She found this strange. She filed it away and kept walking. On the 7th day, a crew member named Harrow died. He was a human engineer, 24 years old, one of the quieter members of the crew. He had been performing maintenance on the outer hull when a microfracture in his suit seal failed. By the time the alarm reached the command deck, he was already gone. There was nothing anyone could have done. The failure was mechanical and fast and entirely no one's fault. Seravin processed the report. She noted the loss in the official record, assigned the remaining engineering tasks to the secondary crew, and sent a formal notification to the Earth Coalition Command. That was procedure. That was what you did. What she did not expect was what happened next. Dallin called a gathering for the full crew in the main corridor, all 12 remaining crew members, Vreth and human alike. He stood at the front and he talked about Harrow. He talked about specific things. The way Harrow always fixed the coffee dispenser when it broke even though it was not his job, the joke he had told badly and then laughed at himself for telling badly, the 3 times he had caught a system error before it became a real problem. Small things. Ordinary things. And then Dallin said, He did good work and he was a good person and we are going to miss him. That is true and it is allowed to be true. Some of the human crew were crying. Seravan watched that with a careful, still expression. On the Vreth side of the corridor, two of her officers stood very straight and very quiet. The way Vreth stood when something was affecting them and they were not sure what to do with it. After the gathering ended, Seravan went to the observation alcove and sat down. She did not turn on any screens. She sat in the dark with the nebula in front of her and she thought. Vreth did not gather for the dead. There was a formal record, a rank ceremony for officers, and then the work continued. Grief was understood to be a private matter, something each soldier managed on their own time, away from the eyes of their unit. Showing grief in front of your crew was considered a form of weakness. It distracted others, it undermined confidence, it served no tactical function. But Harrow's name was said out loud with the entire crew listening, and the crew had stood straighter after, not less. They had gone back to their stations with more focus, not less. The loss was the same, the work was the same, but something had shifted. She was still thinking about it when Dallin appeared in the alcove doorway. He said, "Mind if I sit?" She said nothing, which he apparently interpreted as permission. He sat across from her and looked out at the nebula for a while without speaking. She appreciated that. She was in no mood for talking. After several minutes she asked, "Why do you do that? Gather them." He considered it. Then he said, "Because everyone on this ship is going to keep doing their job and doing it well, and part of the reason they can do that is because when something breaks them open a little, they know the people next to them are not going to pretend it did not happen." She said, "It does not change the loss." He said, "No, but it changes whether they have to carry it alone." She looked at him. She said, "You believe the vulnerability makes them stronger." He said, "I think the vulnerability is the point. When something matters enough to hurt you when it is gone, it means it was real. The caring is not a weakness. The caring is the reason they fight this hard." She had no answer for that. She turned back to the nebula. On the 15th day, they found the Rift Swarm egg cluster. It was buried deep in the inner nebula, hidden in a dense gas pocket that their long-range sensors had missed. When the close-range scan came back, the numbers were staggering. A dormant cluster of over 2,000 eggs, each one capable of producing a full-grown swarm unit. If it hatched, it would release a force large enough to assault an entire star system. The order was clear. Destroy the cluster and get out before anything noticed them. Seravan gave the order to prepare the destroyer payload. Dallin confirmed the targeting sequence, and then one of the crew said, "There is a beacon signal inside the cluster." Everyone went quiet. The beacon was faint, but it was real. A standard Vreth military distress signal, deep inside the egg cluster. Someone was alive in there. One person, possibly. No way to know how long they had been there or how. Seravan calculated the odds. Getting inside the cluster to retrieve one person meant flying a small scout pod through a field of dormant swarm eggs. If even one egg detected the intrusion and activated, the pilot would have seconds. The tactical value of one soldier did not come close to the risk. She said, "We complete the mission. The beacon cannot change the order." Dallin said, "I am going in." She said, "That is not a rational decision." He looked at her and said, very simply, "No, but there is someone in there and we can get them out." He was already moving toward the scout pod bay. She could have stopped him. She did not. She stood at the sensor station for 22 minutes and watched his pod move through the egg cluster on the display screen. She did not speak. She did not move. The crew around her also did not speak. He came back out with a young Vreth soldier named Sev, a border patrol officer who had been captured by the swarm 3 weeks earlier and hidden somehow in a survival capsule inside the cluster. How Sev had survived was a question for another day. When the pod docked and Dallin climbed out, Seravan was standing in the bay. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You are the strangest creature I have ever encountered." He looked back at her. She heard, in her own voice, that it had not sounded like an insult. The attack came without warning. That was what made it different from every swarm engagement in recorded history. The Rift Swarm had always moved in waves, giving the Dominion sensor networks enough time to track their approach and prepare. It was never comfortable, never easy, but there was always some notice, always some window between seeing them coming and the moment they arrived. This time, there was no window. The first strike hit 3 Vreth core worlds simultaneously, not the outer rim, not the border zones, the core worlds, the heart of the Dominion, the systems that held the largest populations and the oldest cities and the command infrastructure that held the entire empire together. The swarm arrived in a force so large that the initial sensor reports were rejected as instrument errors. No one believed the numbers could be real. The numbers were real. Seravan was back at Verith 9 when the emergency transmission came through. She was on the command deck reviewing patrol schedules when every screen in the room changed at once. She read the report once, stood completely still for 2 seconds, and then began issuing orders. Dallin was beside her in under a minute. He read the same screens, said nothing, and started pulling up fleet disposition maps. The High Council met in emergency session, Serevan attended by transmission link, standing in the command room of Verith 9 with the Council's voices in her earpiece and the tactical map spread across the screens in front of her. The Council's position became clear within the first hour. The outer colonies and midrim systems were to be abandoned. All available forces were to concentrate around the innermost core worlds and hold what could be held. Serevan said, "We do not abandon the outer populations." The Council said, "The math does not support full defense." She said, "Then the math needs to change." The Council overruled her. She stood in the command room after the link closed and said nothing for a long time. The crew moved quietly around her, running their tasks, not looking directly at her. Dallin stood at the edge of the room and also said nothing. Then she turned and looked at him. She said, "I need to ask you something." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to ask, not order. I need to ask if the Earth Coalition will send forces. Full forces, not what the Accord requires, more than the Accord requires." He held her gaze. He said, "I need to make a call." He made the call. She did not listen to the conversation. She walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars and did not allow herself to think about what it meant that she had asked. Not ordered, not demanded, not negotiated, asked. He came back in 9 minutes and said, "They are sending everything." She turned. She said, "Everything." He said, "Every available ship, every reserve battalion, every fast response unit they have." The Admiral said to tell you the rest herself. The Earth Coalition Admiral's transmission came through 4 minutes later. Her name was Varel, and she had a calm, steady voice that reminded Serevan faintly of her own instructors. Admiral Varel said, 200 years ago the Vreth held a gate for 11 minutes while our fleet was still in jump. We never forgot, neither did our children. Tell the princess we are coming." The battle that followed lasted 9 days. It was the largest combined military action since the founding of the Joint Operations Accord. It was, by most measures, the largest battle in the history of either species. The swarm fleet was enormous, a main force wave unlike anything the Dominion had faced in 2 centuries. It moved with a terrible patience, consuming everything in its path, and it did not stop. Serevan commanded the joint fleet from the flagship. Dallin stood at the secondary command station 12 feet away. They worked together in a rhythm that neither of them had planned and neither of them discussed. She called fleet positions. He managed the human wing response times. She identified priority targets. He coordinated the strike sequence. There were moments when one of them would start a sentence and the other would finish it. Not because they had rehearsed it, but because after weeks of working together the shape of each other's thinking had become familiar. On the 6th day, the flagship took a direct hit on the port command deck. The blast threw Serevan across the room. She hit the wall and came down hard. Her left side crumpled, a deep gash across her shoulder armor where a panel had sheared through it. She got to her feet in seconds and reached for the command console. Dallin was already beside her. He did not ask if she was all right. He put one hand on her arm to steady her and looked at the wound and said, "Medical bay, now." She said, "I am not leaving the bridge." He said, "The bridge is stable, the fleet has the next sequence, and you are losing blood. You have 3 minutes. I will be here when you get back." She looked at him. There was something in his face that was not a command and not a request and not a negotiation. It was simply someone who was not going to pretend that she was not hurt. She went to the medical bay. She was back in 4 minutes. The wound was sealed and her shoulder was stiff but functional. On the 9th day, the swarm broke. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way large things usually ended, in pieces, at the edges first, and then faster toward the center. The outer swarm units lost coordination, then the mid-force units began to scatter, and then the entire formation collapsed into a retreat that the joint fleet pressed hard for the next 18 hours until the last confirmed swarm unit had left the system. The core worlds held. The silence after the battle was very loud. Serevan stood on the bridge of the flagship and listened to the damage reports come in. The losses were significant, not catastrophic, but significant. Real numbers attached to real names. She would read every one of them. The Earth Coalition losses were on that list too. Human soldiers who had come to a war that was not theirs and fought in it anyway because someone had asked. Dallin was sitting at his station running post-battle diagnostics. He looked tired in a way that humans showed physically, in the lines of their face and the set of their shoulders. She had learned to read those signs. She walked over and stood beside him. She said, "Your people fought well." He looked up. He said, "Yours too." she said. Thank you for the call. He looked at her for a moment and said, You asked, that mattered. She did not tell him what it had cost her to say that word, ask. She did not tell him that it was the first time in her life she had used it and meant it as something other than a formality. She did not tell him that standing at the viewport while he made that call had been one of the most frightening minutes of her life. Not because she feared his answer, but because she realized, in that minute, how much she needed it to be yes. She filed all of that away in the place inside herself where she put things she was not ready to examine. The war was over. Something else was just beginning. The Vreth. Imperial Throne World was the most beautiful place Seravan had ever stopped noticing. She had grown up in the Palace District, walked its stone corridors 10,000 times, looked out from its high towers over the silver-grey city below. It was home in the way that home eventually becomes invisible. You stopped seeing it because you had always seen it. The grand architecture, the formal gardens, the deep resonance of the ceremonial bells that rang at dawn, all of it had become background noise long ago. But she noticed it now, because Dallin was seeing it for the first time. He walked through the main entrance hall of the Imperial seat and looked up at the vaulted ceiling with an expression that she had come to recognize as his version of awe, not loud, not theatrical, but a quiet stillness that came over his face when something impressed him. He looked at the carved stone columns and the banners of the old Thornblood campaigns and the long windows that let in the pale amber light of the throne world sun, and he said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, This is old. She said, 4,000 years. He said, That is older than most of what exists on Earth. She said, I know. They walked on. She was aware, in a way that she could not entirely explain, that she was glad he was seeing it. She had brought him here as part of the formal post-war diplomatic proceedings. The Earth Coalition delegation had been invited to the throne world for the first time in history, and Dallin was part of that delegation in his capacity as Joint Operations Commander. His presence was official and appropriate and entirely professional. She told herself this several times during the walk from the landing bay to the palace. She was not entirely sure who she was telling it to. The coronation proceedings were formal and long. The High Council had been moving toward naming her empress since before the war, and the war had removed the last political obstacles. She sat through 3 days of ceremony and ritual with the particular patience she had developed for exactly this kind of necessary tedium. She knew every part of the ritual. She had been preparing for it since she was a child. On the evening of the third day, the council convened for the final formal session. There was one remaining procedural matter before the coronation could be completed, the naming of a consort. The Vreth political tradition held that an empress must name a bonded partner before taking the throne, not because the empress required one to rule, but because the line required continuity and the people required the symbol of it. A consort was stability. A consort was a declaration of permanence. The High Council presented the list. There were 11 names on it, all Vreth, all from old families, all carefully selected for political value and genetic compatibility. The council had done their work thoroughly. Any one of those 11 names would have been an appropriate choice. Any one of them would have satisfied the tradition and smoothed the transition and closed this final procedural matter in an orderly and logical way. Seravan looked at the list. She said, No. The council chamber went very quiet. One of the senior council members said, Princess, these names represent the best aligned candidates in the Dominion. The selection was made according to all established criteria. She said, I understand. My answer is still no. Another council member said, The tradition requires. She said, I know the tradition. I also know that tradition was created to ensure that the bond was one of strength and commitment, not political convenience. I will honor the spirit of that tradition today. She stood. She looked across the chamber to where the Earth Coalition delegation stood in the observer gallery. Dallin was at the end of the row, standing in his dress uniform with the same quiet calm he always carried. He had not been watching her with any particular expression. He was simply there, the way he was always simply there. She walked down from the council dais. She walked across the full width of the chamber floor. Everyone in the room watched her. She was aware of every pair of eyes, and she did not slow down. She stopped in front of Dallin. She reached out and took his hand. In Vreth culture, the gesture had a meaning so specific and so loaded that it required no words. Taking someone's hand in a formal assembly, in front of witnesses, was not a question. It was a declaration. It was the oldest and most unambiguous way the Vreth had of saying, This person is mine and I am theirs, and the space between us is closed. The council chamber erupted. She heard voices. She heard movement. She heard the sharp intake of breath that ran through the Vreth side of the room like a wave. She did not turn around. Dallin looked at her. She watched him understand what was happening. She watched him look at their hands and then back at her face. His expression did something complicated that she had no word for. He did not pull away. She turned then and faced the chamber. She said, in the full formal register of the Thornblood line, in the carrying voice she had been trained since childhood to use in rooms like this one. I swore I would never take a consort out of duty. I swore I would never take one out of politics. I swore I would never take one out of weakness. I keep that vow today. What I choose now, I choose because I am strong enough to know the difference between duty and truth. I choose it because it is true. The chamber was silent. The senior council member said, very carefully, the candidate is not Vreth. She said, no, he is human. He is also the only person in this room who has never been afraid of me, never tried to manage me, and never once offered me a worse solution when he had a better one. He fought in our war because we asked. He walked into a swarm egg cluster because one person was worth it. He told a grieving crew that their loss was real and allowed to be real, and they fought harder afterward, not less. If the Dominion is going to survive the next 4,000 years, it will be because it learns what that means. Another long silence. And then, from the far end of the observer gallery, one of the Earth Coalition diplomats started to clap, a single human sound, bare and awkward in the stone chamber, and then two more hands joined, and then the human soldiers in the delegation, and then, after a pause that felt like an entire history deciding something, Orith, the young Vreth guard who had walked out of a sealed corridor because a human refused to leave him there, raised his own four hands and struck them together. Seravan looked at Dallin. He looked back at her with the expression she still did not have a word for, and then, quietly, he said, for the record, I was always a little afraid of you. She said, good, that means you are paying attention. He was still holding her hand. They both knew he was not going to let go. In the years that followed, other empires and civilizations and distant watching species would analyze that moment in 100 different ways. They would write about the political implications and the diplomatic significance and what it meant for the balance of power between species. Some would call it dangerous, some would call it historic, some would file updated threat assessments about humans and their unsettling habit of forming bonds in places where bonds had no right to grow. But the simple truth of it, the part that survived every analysis, was this. A princess who had vowed never to be vulnerable chose to be, and the galaxy was never quite the same afterward.